Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. My name is Colin Moriarty. Today I'm joined by a very special guest, returning to the show, I believe, Jez Corden, managing editor of Windows Central and co-host of the Xbox 2 podcast, prolific Xbox-centric content creator, journalist, writer, media personality. Welcome back to the show, my friend. Good to see you.
Hello. This is actually the first time, I think.
Haven't we recorded together?
Yeah, you were on my show.
Oh,
you were on
that's what it was.
XP2+1. And I've been on Defining Duke as well.
Okay, great, right. But, kind of sort of welcome back to Sacred to Last Stand anyway.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
It's good to see you, my friend. So you're in Europe. It's later there. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me post dinner. I like to try to get everything recorded early. So I'm glad when I have to record overseas. I'm glad that people are amicable to that. So thank you for that, or amenable to that, I should say. But how's everything going with you, my friend? What's going on with your life and all the rest? How's the new year treating you so far?
It's going all right, man. I mean, obviously in the Xbox world, there's been quite a lot of tumult, as far as you could call it. A lot of drama. The Xbox community is in a bit of a civil war over the direction of Microsoft right now. But I think like the wider gaming industry is also in a lot of sort of tumult, and there's this sort of perfect storm of every company kind of trying to evolve its strategy to accommodate the weird economy we find ourselves in globally. So I've sort of, working in the media is kind of, you're caught in that as well a little bit, because advertising revenue being what it is, and affiliate revenue and all that kind of stuff. The whole sort of the idea that consumers are more pressed for time than ever, and their money stretched further than ever, supposedly, has that impact across all of tech, I think, in a way. Unless, of course, you are NVIDIA and making AI and doing servers and stuff like that.
Yeah, to that. I was just listening to a podcast about them, about how much they're growing comparable to to other tech companies, and it's really wild. Thousands of % over periods of time, which is crazy.
Absolutely insane.
Yeah, it's a weird time. I've been doing this for a long time. You have too, and this is a strange period in gaming, I think, for many different reasons. Yet I also think, and I make this argument on Sacred a lot, Jez, is I kind of feel like the output's pretty strong still. It's not necessarily strong from first parties. Maybe from Nintendo, you could say it's a little stronger, but generally speaking, I'm pretty satisfied as well. Like, I'm overwhelmed as fuck. Right before I left last weekend to go to Boston with my wife for a weekend just to go see a Bruins game, and right before that, they had announced that Stalker collection coming out. And I was like, fucking Christ. Like, that's more games I want to check out. Then I come back and they announced that Grandia collection. And I'm like, come on, man. Now, I know these are old games, but I'm just so overwhelmed to the point where and I know Chris, my co-host, articulates this a lot and better than I do, which is like, I don't feel this need to know, like, where is the game? There are just so many things to play that they could shut everything down, basically. Yeah. And wouldn't be great for the industry's health, but it would be great for my backlog. So
yeah, I don't feel like it. I mean, I always try and compare things, the way things are now, to the way things were when we were younger. And I feel like when I was younger, and obviously like when you're actually working in the industry or working close to the industry and covering the industry, your mentality is a little bit different. So I try to be mindful of that. But at the same time, I don't remember a time in my life where there was just like so much to play. I feel like during the 360 era, there were like these periods of drought where it'd be like, I don't know what I'm going to play, or I'm just going to play Warcraft or something. But now it's just like, yeah, like you say, like Grandia, Stalker, there's like a Bulwark I want to play. Thaumaturge I still haven't played. I haven't finished Elden Ring. For some reason, I haven't finished the Cyberpunk DLC. I've been trying to do that before Dragon's Dogma 2 comes out. So I've sunk another 40 hours into Cyberpunk, and it's like, and there just doesn't seem to be a period that I'm aware of where there's so much high quality content out there, and at the same time, they seem to be struggling to find the people, or at least some publishers seem to be struggling to find the people to actually buy and play this content. And I suppose that's for a variety of different reasons.
Yeah, the relative, everyone talks about this, but the relative flatness of console gaming in terms of growing in size is, I don't know if it's concerning. It's just it's stagnant for sure. There doesn't seem to be more than 200 to 300 million people that want to buy a console at any one time. But I think those numbers are pretty strong to be able to extract things. I don't know. To me, Jez, my brother and I reflect on this a lot on our retro podcast, is I do kind of miss the days of knowing every game that came out. And I think that you could trace that back even to a really boisterous generation like PS2, GameCube, and Xbox. That was probably the last time I was like familiar with pretty much not playing it, but familiar with everything that came out. And we talk about the NES, which is my favorite console of all time, where it's like, you're never going to show me, you can show me 10 NES games and one of them will be fake. And I'll be like, that's the fake NES game, right? Like, I know it because there's only 800 of them. So I want to underline your point though. When I was an intern at IGN many, many years ago, one of my things that I had to do was upgrade the database for dates, for release dates. I used to have to scour like EV Games and like all these websites and get release dates. And there were entire weeks and months where nothing came out. And it was normal. Usually the summer, December, January, games wouldn't come out. Now you see games like Crisis Core coming out a week before Christmas, doing extraordinarily well last year. You see games coming out for a second week in January doing extraordinarily well. There is no downtime. So though I'm disappointed in kind of the first party output, less so the second party output, but the first party output's a little disappointing. I'm looking at my cross media bar when I turn on my PS5. It's like, well, Helldivers distracts me constantly. I'm working my way through Final Fantasy. I still have to play Pacific Drive. It's like, I don't know, man. I feel like there's a conflict in me because I get what people are saying. It's very similar to what you were saying, but I feel personally satisfied, if anything, overwhelmed. So I'm good.
Yeah, I mean, I've had some back and forth this week with Xbox fans in the community, like, because obviously there's a lot of Xbox fans that are unhappy for a variety of reasons, and but like when I zoom out personally, and for all of Microsoft's faults and all their missteps over the last decade, it's like I'm more satisfied than ever with what I'm being offered as a console gamer. But I've got a handheld that has cross save with my Xbox games, and I can take my Xbox games on the plane, use Ace ROG Ally or Lenovo Legion Go, and some of those features that I suppose now we take for granted, like full backwards compatibility, PS4 and PS5 with backwards compatibility, and then you've got the Xbox 360 going all the way back to the original Xbox in some cases on the Microsoft side, like all that sort of stuff. That sort of we take for granted now. A lot of people sort of still finding reasons to be unsatisfied, and like you mentioned, the first party output. I do wonder how much of it is nostalgia and kind of is to some degree tribalism, where because Sony's first party output this year, supposedly isn't looking so hot, and they're leaning a lot on second party publishing deals, whereas Microsoft had their notorious 2022, where they didn't have a lot of content from first party output, but there was still just tons of stuff to play, And like on PlayStation, it's like you're never going to run out of things to play, like was the case when maybe we were kids. But still, there's all these layoffs, and so like you have to wonder: are they putting out too much content? Is it just the case that there's too much content and not enough bodies? And I think that's where some of the changes we're seeing some readjustments. I hate these terms like correction,
Right. Yeah.
and you have to wonder, like, in a world where I think it was Matt Piscatella from MPD or Sakana, what they're called now. He said that like these black hole games, like your Fortnite and your Call of Duty and your Roblox, are sort of dominating the attention span of the next generation, which kind of is stifling growth from the kind of games that perhaps we would want to play, or publishers that make the kind of games we might want to play, or people of a certain age might want to play, So it is a weird time. It feels like we're going through almost a generational transition, and they haven't figured out how to bring Gen Z on board, or the even Gen Alpha, the next generation after that. I don't know, man. It's crazy. It's crazy to try and take all this in.
Yeah, I agree. It's some sort of confluence of like technologies that will eradicate the console ultimately, though it's taken a lot longer than I think many of us thought. It's taken longer than I thought it would take. If you asked me 15 years ago, would we still be playing consoles in 2024? I'd be like, no, I don't, probably not. We'll probably still be playing in some sort of ecosystem, but it'll be digital or whatever. So we're not there yet. And yeah, it's funny you touch on something, Jez, that I talk about on Sacred that I agree with you, which is we don't have too many games. We have way too many games being released. I think now a lot of this isn't, you can't really do much about this, but I do think the walled gardens could do more to facilitate higher quality generally on their storefronts. Like if you look at PSN, for instance, it's pretty bad. I mean, there's a lot of games, many games as we just talked about to play, but you have to find them. And they don't do very much in someone wrote into me, which I thought was kind of brilliant. I'm not really an AI person, but they were like, basically the reason you go on Amazon and it always knows what you want. It's like, why can't they do that on PSN? Like then it doesn't matter how much Amazon sells. It matters about how you can find it. But I generally agree with you. And that's why I think these layoffs are corrective in there doesn't need to be this many people making games. And there's not going to be, as AI and all these things unfortunately take hold, I think there's going to be fewer people making games. But that's why I just don't even get very excited when new studios are announced, or don't even really report on them anymore. Like these guys are doing this and these guys made this AAA game and these guys are doing this. I'm like, I don't care. Well, I'll find out more when your game comes out. And it's funny that this churn happened so much. Like I reported that the Deviation PlayStation game was canceled a year ago because it was. And it's funny that there's so much news and so much like such a load of games for people to deal with that's like circulating now that they've closed down completely as, oh, their PlayStation game's canceled. I'm like, their PlayStation game's been canceled. There's so many games and so much news about these games that you can't even keep up with it.
Was that the Treyarch studio?
Yeah, and they actually they got many of those people that were, so I knew through a connection at Deviation that they were going to lay people off weeks before they did. This was last year. And the guy that was talking to was like, the game's canceled. Like Sony pulled their funding, it's over. And they stayed alive trying to get contract work, like as a skeleton team, and they did for about a year, and then they went away completely. But in that time, and we reported this on Sacred Symbols, is that like Sony had started poaching a bunch of those people after the game was canceled, including what's his name, the Zombies guy, Jason Blundell or whatever. They all work at Sony on and in some like secret team that has not been announced, and it's unclear to me if it's going to be like, if it's just like the visual arts group in San Diego, or if it's going to be like some sort of unnamed team that they will eventually name when their game gets announced. But those guys were taking over. So that the writing was on the wall for Deviation. You also knew that it wasn't going well for them because Sony bought the other two teams that they announced in that little tranche, in Firewalk and in Haven. So, but yeah, it's a tumultuous time out there. It's interesting. I'm glad to have a mind like yours on the show to talk about all these things, and everyone else is tired of talking to me, I think, on the show anyway. So let me ask you about this. I'm really curious about this. You're, and I don't mean this facetiously at all. You're a well-connected games writer in the Xbox space.
I am.
And there's this tweet, and I know what this is like because things I say get circulated all the time. A tweet circulating about how nothing was going to come to PlayStation in December. You said this.
Yeah.
How do you feel like they hid this so well? Because I know lots of people at Sony and in the PlayStation studios. There are certainly things I don't know, and there are things that I've been told that don't pan out, and then so like my Bloodborne reporting, for instance, about a new Bloodborne, that's like lost in the mist. I have no idea where it went, but I do know the people that told me about it years ago. So you hear some things, but you don't hear other things. So it's not surprising to me that they would hide something from you. It's just, or that you not hide something from you specifically, that something would be so well hidden that you wouldn't be able to figure it out. That's the nature of journalism. But yeah, how do you think this all kind of came to be, that their games would come over so rapidly and in such volume, and that they must have been doing this for about a year or so to port these games, I would assume 6 months to a year. I read a piece, I think it was in The Guardian or something, about how they had at Rare like frosted glass windows around where they were making the games. I just don't get how this was kept so secret unless both sides knew it was so monumental that they went to their respective people and were like, you really can't leak this. Like, this really cannot leak. And so what are your thoughts on this?
First of all, to address that hilarious tweet that I put out, I said something to the effect of, I'm investigating these rumors, and it's all just fanboy FUD or whatever, right? And the reason I put that out there was because I was investigating a couple of games specifically. I was investigating Hellblade 2, which I confirmed is not being developed right now for PlayStation. Who knows what happens in the future, but right now, no. And also Starfield, right? I'd investigated those two games, and I got those two confirmed. And I was just like, it was Christmas, and I was tired, and I was just like, my sort of emotional response was, this is just a load of bullshit, and I just sort of tweeted it without sort of, thinking about how it could bite me in the ass, because I thought, well, you know, it was Starfield was a lot of the rumors that I was getting, but I think what really happened was that people did know at Microsoft that something was happening with the games coming to other platforms. They just didn't know what they were. So maybe they thought of like some that would be obvious. Starfield's probably an obvious one because, you've got history of Fallout and Elder Scrolls on PlayStation. Hellblade 2 is probably an obvious one because Hellblade 1 was PlayStation exclusive, I think, for a little while.
Yeah, it was like a timed third-party game, I want to say, yeah.
Yeah.
Because they had a relationship with them going back to Heavenly Sword,
Yeah. So, like, I suppose, like, the rumors that were coming out, and there clearly were rumors coming out, and there was smoke, but maybe they just didn't know what the games were. So, I was just, honestly, it was just laziness, I was just like, I was tired, and I was like, I'm not investigating this any further. It was Christmas, and I'd been traveling, because I live between two countries, and I was just like, screw this, But then the rumors persisted, and then we got Hi-Fi Rush and Sea of Thieves, pretty much confirmed, and then, I was like, damn, this is actually happening, isn't it? So obviously, I deleted the tweet because it's misinformation at this point. But the internet never forgets, and that's just a big fuck up on my part. Frankly.
Yeah, but it is a yeah. It is, you can say whatever you want. It is a fuck up in some sense, but I've been there, and
yeah, I was just
like
tired.
Where you just say something kind of flippant, and you're like not even about your reporting, but just something flippant. And yeah, people just never forget. That's why I always, as I've gotten older, kind of just been a little bit more patient with people generally, like how they're perceived. Like when you see someone post something and then they're continuously responded with the same three things, it's like, well, that can't possibly be the full structure of this person's, body of work. So, so the bigger thing that didn't frustrate me at all because it frustrates me that people keep bringing it up and kind of attacking you with it. I think that's kind of as a friend of yours, I think that's kind of shitty.
Fine.
But I do think the bigger thing, and you and I talked about this behind the scenes, was I feel like when you talked to Phil Spencer, you could have gotten him, and you and I discussed this now. I know you had a brief amount of time with him and you but are you surprised by how buttery these guys are in terms of always slipping out? Like I just feel like Xbox's dudes are pretty well media trained, and are willing to talk, but they talk.
Phil would have admitted it if I'd have asked him specifically. I think he would have said it because he's really frank. Like when you speak to him at like events and stuff, he must drive their PR guys crazy because Phil's quite frank, and you probably saw that in the Kind of Funny interview from before the summer where he was really frank about the state of Xbox. Phil's quite frank and upfront about it because he's gone as high as you can possibly go in this industry. So, he's a really straightforward guy about some of this stuff. But at the same time, they're technologists, right, at Microsoft, and they are very cognizant of the fact that technology is moving very rapidly. Platforms are changing and evolving very rapidly, and the regulatory situation is evolving too with regards to walled gardens, especially in European Union. Now, the European Union's trying to crack walled gardens open, like your iOS and your not so much Android, but they're trying to make everything more Windows-like, basically. They're like, we like Windows, how anyone can build for Windows, and we want Android, iOS, everything to be like that. And then Microsoft and Sony have this position where they have to explain, look, we don't make any money on the hardware. Apple makes a ton of money on the hardware and they take a cut on the software. We don't. So, like, if you take this away from us, you're going to kill the business. But they're cognizant of the fact that the European Union might not care or even understand that respect. And, you know, in that situation where the console walled garden gets split open, Microsoft has to be sort of ready to respond to that. Sony too, potentially, and be like, okay, well, if they are forcing us to open up Xbox and forcing us to open up PlayStation, we have to have a pipeline in place to get our software to where it needs to be as quickly as possible. So that's why, like, and I know this frustrates Xbox fans because when Phil won't say never, he won't say we will never put Starfield on it on PlayStation, because he doesn't know if there might be a regulatory framework forced upon them someday where they have no choice. And it's like, if they're doing it, then we have to do it. And that's why they don't want to put this rubber stamp on it, because they don't want to be caught out, you know, saying, well, you said never, you know, and now it's happening. But that's the thing, like, because they won't say never, people don't believe them when they say it's only going to be these 4 games. And from what I understand right now, as of this minute, it is only these 4 games while they experiment with how it could impact the sentiment of the brand and impact the monthly active users across the Xbox ecosystem, which includes Xbox One, S, X, Series S and X, and 360 a little bit. There's a lot of paying customers still on 360 from what I understand. But they consider that their entire monthly active user base. And they haven't been as good as Sony at moving people from Xbox One to Xbox Series S and X, but they don't need to, because if all they're doing is playing Call of Duty, they might as well just stay where they are, right? As long as they're still spending money. So I think, like, we haven't really hit that point where people need to upgrade to the next gen systems within those black hole games we talked about. But Grand Theft Auto is going to be an event that I think impacts the console ecosystem, where a lot of people who are in that proclivity will be like, okay, now we need to upgrade. But, you know, it's a slight tangent there. With regards to, like, you know, the way they do sort of, they don't give people the answers they want and the clarity they want, is because we are living in these sort of weird times, like we talked about at the start of the show, where things are evolving very rapidly. Things are changing very quickly. The global economy is in a weird place, and there are geopolitical things happening which could further, you know, kick inflation back into high gear, you know, especially outside of America. Like, America's like ramped up oil production, you know, not to get too deep into geopolitics, but America's ramped up oil production to offset their inflation, right? Other countries don't have that luxury. And if it gets to a point where it's like, okay, then the rest, say something else happens, and that, you know, oil production drops somewhere else, and that affects global supply chains, which, you know, increases the price of food, which drives up the price of inflation, and you know, drives up inflation and then inflates costs. You get to a point where it's like, if your costs are going up and up and up for whatever reason, geopolitical or otherwise, you have to remember that these install bases aren't growing fast enough, at least for Xbox. I can't speak for PlayStation or Nintendo because I don't really investigate it. But like, what Microsoft's view is, like, we don't know if, like, the costs are going to go up again for whatever geopolitical reason, because things aren't super stable right now, to the point where it's like the costs are outstripping the pace of growth of the install base, because the install base is growing. They said in their last quarterly that they've got record monthly active users on console. And I went back to PR and I said, when you're talking about monthly active users, are you talking specifically about console, or is it console, cloud, and PC? And they said, no, this means specifically console users. So even though, like, the Xbox Series S and X are selling more slowly, they are still growing, you know. And I think, like, but it's probably not growing fast enough for them, or fast enough for capitalism. And Sony's probably thinking the same thing too. Like, we need to grow more quickly to accommodate these spiraling costs for whatever reason. And when you do have your profit margins in such a slim amount, where I think Sony's somewhere between 6 and 8%, if I remember correctly, at
Yeah,
the moment.
it's like almost 8%, I think, last quarter,
Yeah,
which is bad.
it's spooky, man. Like
Yeah.
if something happens, that 8% or wherever it is could go 8% into the negative real quickly if you don't like look to how you can grow. Now Sony has a luxury of, doing day and day on PC, but then what's the next step? What happens in 5 years when all this happens again? You've got to find the new growth. But then they start considering what Microsoft's considering now and going to PlayStation. It's the issue is that consoles, the install base of all of console isn't growing fast enough to keep up pace with costs, and it's just because it's a maturing industry, I guess, and we're all getting older.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're too old, man.
It's it is true. I mean, it is funny that we used to say it at IGN back in the day. I'm sure it's still true because I don't have the data or whatever. But like the average age of a gamer goes up 1 year basically every year.
Yeah,
like because we are. It's really Generation X, and then I'm an elder millennial. What year were you born?
86.
86. I'm 84. So we're very similar in age. So it's really like my brothers, Generation X, and then us are really still the foundational element of of console gaming as it's currently constituted, which is interesting. You said a few things I wanted to ask you about, or just kind of mention.
Sure.
I love what you said about Phil Spencer being so blunt, and I personally think Phil talks out of both sides of his mouth sometimes, but I do appreciate that he talks. I think Sony's strategy clearly, and I've covered Sony for a long time, since the PS3 and PSP generation professionally. But I was in the industry in the PS2 generation, so I was dealing with them then as well, just not as deeply. And they're different now, very, very different. They don't say shit to anyone. And I personally have no problem with that because we have no relationship with Sony. I haven't personally spoken to a person at Sony since 2018. So, and we don't, as you know, we don't accept any games or access or whatever. I just don't want to deal with any of these people. But I think that their strategy of not talking has actually worked, unfortunately. It's annoying because there's very little to talk about or say when they don't say anything. I grew up in an era of not only, Ken Kutaragi and Kaz and all of this kind of stuff came up in this era, but people that would talk to you, Gio Corsi's still a personal friend of mine, and it's because we used to speak to each other all the time. And Shuei Yoshida, when I go to Japan, we would go to dinner and he would talk to me about all sorts of different things and all this. Like, that's just a total different generation. I think beginning with Jim Ryan, they started to want to talk to GQ and Wired and just in very controlled ways. But to what you're saying, Jez, I think it makes a lot of sense in hindsight because you don't want to lie. You don't want to deceive people. So the best way to not do that is to just avoid being asked any questions at all. And
pretty much.
Yeah. And they've done it to great success. I mean, I'm not really a journalist anymore, but as an ex-journalist, let's say, or kind of a recovering journalist, I find it frustrating because I used to be able to email them or call them. I used to cold call them all the time, PR people at Sony. That's the best way. I remember when I was at IGN, it's like, no, don't email them, call them, like get them on the spot, and now I know that those kinds of things aren't even an option anymore. And it bums me out a little bit. So I just wanted to reflect on that.
Microsoft's still very accessible, and it's interesting because Windows Central, we were part of a company that we were Windows Central, Android Central, and iMore, which is Apple Central, basically. And it was funny, like when the three teams we're all under the one banner, how differently Microsoft behaved compared to Apple. And like Apple is very much like in the Sony sort of mindset where they only talk to GQ and these prestige brands. And I think part of that is to give yourself this sort of prestigious image, whereas Microsoft has a different mindset. They always go to grassroots, always go to grassroots. Like they engage like the smallest YouTube channels, and they engaged me when I had like 150 followers or something, and back in the day, and they and this was not for Xbox, this was for Windows Phone, when I was covering Windows Phone. And yeah, there probably wasn't a lot of options out there for people to cover Windows Phone, right? But and they flew me out to Barcelona when I was I had a little hobby blog. I wasn't making any money. I was doing it part-time. I was doing it at work to refresh my HTML, coding and stuff, and my CSS. And And they flew me out to Barcelona. I couldn't believe it, And all the other people that flown out there again were small bloggers, small Instagrammers, photographers, little small, phone influencers and stuff like that. There was no like big gaming influencers there, and I'm not quite sure, how well that serves them, but it does curate this sort of there's a double edge to it, right? Because you do get like you can win a lot of loyalty with the Xbox Fan Fest and stuff, but you end up with a lot of, I suppose you could call it, parasocial relationships where
Yes.
people get too loyal, and then when Microsoft does things that they don't like this, then they feel personally betrayed, So it can have the opposite impact from a marketing and sentiment perspective, potentially. But, the truth is, it's such a small portion of the overall audience. And I keep having to remind myself that the vast majority of console gamers are not people who get on Twitter or even read websites or listen to my podcast and stuff like this. They're literally they get home from work and all they want to do is unwind and play a Minecraft, a Fortnite, or a Call of Duty. And I think that's part of the overall pie of dilemmas that some of the traditional games companies are having when they're trying to find that growth. Is like, how do we get the mainstream potentially outside of the typical install base interested in gaming? How do we get younger gamers interested in traditional gaming? Should we even bother getting younger gamers interested in gaming? And that's why Microsoft acquired things like Minecraft and Call of Duty, because they still want to be in the game, and rather than let the generational gap run away from them. But and then you have to ask yourself, will people even be playing Call of Duty in 5 years? And then what? What would they do then? But then, they're also technologists and they don't want to stand still. It's a weird sort of, it's a balance to walk, And you kind of see this in a microcosmic kind of way with legacy franchises. Like, take Halo as an example. Halo's like been around for so long that you've got fans of the original Halo who don't want anything about it changed, and you got Microsoft who have to figure out ways of modernizing it. I remember when everyone was mad about Halo adding sprint to the game, or the softest version of aiming down the sights and stuff, and people were mad about it, and the ground pound attack and stuff like that, and people were like, oh, this isn't my Halo, because they're trying to battle that. We've got to appeal to gamers who expect some aspects of Call of Duty versus the legacy fans who don't want it to be modernized, But at a macrocosmic scale, that's like the entire gaming industry right now. And but there's still a lot of weird success stories peppered in around that, like Baldur's Gate 3. Who would have thought Baldur's Gate 3 would end up blowing up as hard as it did?
Yeah.
When it's like, it is literally as classic as you can get, but with a massive AAA budget, So there's this encouraging grassroots signs there, but again, that's still the same install base, I suppose. I don't know, man. I don't know.
To me, it's interesting, Jez, because I do see promising signs too that like things are okay when you see a game like Pal World do really well, both a la carte and on Game Pass. When you see a game like Helldivers doing really well, like I can tell you from my point of view and from my own, I guess, silo, is that like Sony absolutely had no idea Helldivers 2 was going to be big. None. It's so obvious that they had no idea. and it's not only from the crush on servers and all that kind of stuff. They just never even had an open beta for it. The game was in development for 8 years. I mean, they rebooted it, at some point and started it again, basically. And so I know they believed in it to some extent, but it's interesting to see these games not only sneak up on audiences, but sneak up on the people closest to them, which is what happens when you're close to a product for so long. You can't see the forest for the trees at that point. But and then, of course, on the other end, you see the, Hogwarts 22 million copies sold, and so on and so forth. I do wonder if they can figure out a way to extract more money out of maybe a similar sized audience. And that was one of the things I wanted to ask you that kind of came up in passing was, what about game pricing? I feel like games are just too cheap. I've long said that, and I felt that way at different times. So I can't say that it's like exclusive to this economically trying time that I feel this way, but I do feel like the game increase that Sony kind of jumped on the grenade and did $10, that's already been subsumed by the cost of inflation. So we're back really at square one. Yep. And people kind of I understand why people recoil at this, but it's like, I feel like games should run the whole gamut of pricing from free to play and completely accessible with no microtransactions where you maybe have ads, all the way to $100, $120, $150 games where you can think about Red Dead 2 is the one that always comes to mind for me, where I'm like, this game is so unnecessarily big. Like, it could have been 2/3 of it. The last third of it, I won't spoil it for anyone, but it's like, could have been DLC. Like, I don't know why it wasn't. And that you got so much bang for your buck there. I could imagine a Grand Theft Auto 5 or 6, $80. You know, they're not going to do it, but $80 or $100. It's like, why not, man? Like, why not believe in the intrinsic value of your game and say it's worth more than this? I'm not even making the argument of when we were kids, and I know this well and I remember this well, of games being $60, $80, and $100. Like, they were. If you bought some Genesis games, some SNES games, they were $80, $90, $100. If you bought, the cheapest game you were going to get on NES was $40 or $50, and this was in 1990. So yeah. I just feel like, do you agree with me, or do you disagree that there's something about the stubbornness of game pricing where I know games sell more copies. I know it's a more lucrative industry. They don't need to, $100 for Phantasy Star 4 was because the game was on cartridge with all this bespoke chipset, and it was only going to sell 1 million copies, and they needed to make their money back and all of the rest. But so I understand those problems don't exist anymore, but still, I feel like the demand from the audience is high quality, and so you have to pay for it. And I wonder what you think of that.
I kind of had like an experience with that when I was a kid, and I don't know if this is because my local game shop was, exploiting the scarcity of the cartridge, but I remember I went there with my mom when I was like, I don't know, I would have been 9 or 10 or something, to buy Majora's Mask, and it was 80 quid in the 90s or whenever it launched. I think it was the late 90s.
2000. Yeah.
2000, okay. Yeah. So I would have been 11, or 10 or 11, 12, something like that. I went to buy Majora's Mask, and it was 80 quid, which in yesterday's money, it was probably more like 100 quid. It's about $120-ish, and it's kind of like, at the time, my mum was like, "You're not having a game that costs this much, right? It's too expensive. You can have a cheaper game." I can't remember what game I got instead. I think I ended up with Lilac Wars, which is Star Fox. For some reason, Star Fox had a copyright issue in the UK, so it was called Lilac Wars here.
Right.
But I got some other game. I don't know. I can't remember what it was. But that was, I believed that it was priced higher because it was Zelda, Majora's Mask or whatever. And the chances are it was just being exploited by my local game shop or whatever, because there was like a shortage. But I'm in two minds about it, right? Because I'm a tech guy, right? I'm the kind of guy who'd be like, I like my Xbox Series X at $500, but what would it look like if there was a $700 version which could run Dragon's Dogma 2 at 60 frames per second? I'd be okay with that. Your Dragon's Dogma 2's got unlocked frame rate, so like give me a more powerful version that does offer a more, 60 frames as standard, 4K 60 as standard. I would pay for that, right? But when it comes to games, I think like there's a mistrust there where it's like, okay, are you pricing this game higher because it's worth it, or because you're just going to pocket those profits? Are you actually going to reinvest that money into the development of the game and make the game at Red Dead's level? I think there are some devs that have earned the right to do that, and Rockstar is probably one of them, And I think if GTA 6 did launch at a higher price, I think they could get away with it, you know. But like another way they extract more value is like obviously microtransactions. So that gives people the opportunity to set their own price in a way, because it's be like, how much do I want to invest in this game? When I bought Monster Hunter World, it gave me so much content that I actively sought out their DLC and microtransactions, which weren't in game for some reason. You had to go to the Xbox store to find their DLC. And it was just things like extra hairstyles, stuff like that, right? But I was like, I love this game so much, I'm going to buy every piece of DLC to show my appreciation for this game. So in a way, I kind of set my own price there. And then Iceborne dropped, which was, again, one of the best expansions ever if you're a Monster Hunter fan. It was like, I can't believe this is priced as it is. I feel like they could get away with more. This is like a full game. And they're selling it for like $30 or $40 or wherever it was. So I agree in essence, but I think like what you have to do is you kind of have to give people that choice of being like, how much do you want to pay for it, you know? And I think DLC is a good way of doing that. Like you said, they could have cut out some of Red Dead 2 and sold it as DLC potentially. And I'm sure there are some, you know, there's that whole day one DLC controversy from back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure there has been situations where I'm sure like with Starfield, for example, there's a whole faction that's basically missing from the game. And I think the DLC is going to be that faction, Shattered Space. I'm sure Bethesda would have been like, we would have loved to have gotten that in the base game, but for whatever reason they couldn't hack it. They're like, we've got to ship this now because of cash flow, and we'll sell that as DLC later. I mean, it's fine. Starfield, I got like 100 hours out of Starfield, and I know some people don't like it, but I got exactly, you know, it's not the best Bethesda game in the world, but I enjoyed it for what it was. But you know, using a different example, this is one of the reasons why they like NFTs so much. The idea of NFTs. I mean, NFTs are gone now, but they like the idea of NFTs because it was like people could set their own value. The responsibility of value passes on from the publisher to the user then, and the Counter-Strike skins kind of do this to some degree, where it's like, nobody gets mad at Valve if a skin is worth $1,000 because we've decided it's worth $1,000, right? So I think one of the issues that you've got if you are doing $100 game is the backlash. There will be a backlash if Ubisoft or Microsoft sold a game for $100 because people perhaps don't trust those publishers to do that. So you have to figure out a mechanism for people to set their own price and be like, well, you've decided it's worth this. Kickstarter does that to some degree. Mm-hmm. They get like when Larian back in the day was kickstarting games, they'd be like, okay, this is the base price, and then if you want deluxe edition, and then this edition, and like 10 different editions, and it sort of goes all the way up to like $500 edition. You get your name in the credits, and you kind of decide your own value then. So I agree in essence, and I like the idea of quadruple A. Not Skull and Bones, but I like the idea of like, what does it look like if you do have a game that has these ridiculous budgets that really could deliver that sort of truly uncompromising experiences? Like, what if we could get more games like Red Dead Redemption, you know, rather than waiting a million years to get them? What if like a game like Starfield could be perfect, you know? How do you get there? You know, you need more devs, and then, well, you need more money. And so I think that is a fundamental, it's an interesting discussion to have, and I can see both sides of it. Me personally, I'd love to see what that looks like. I'd love to see what it looks like if there is a business model that works that can facilitate a truly uncompromised gaming experience. And there has been experiments like this. You know, Star Citizen comes to mind. How much funding has that game had?
Oh my God.
And it just hasn't delivered.
Yeah.
Hasn't delivered.
And people still give it money. I'm not even, I've been years away from being interested in that at this point, because it's not like people got ripped off or feel like they got ripped off and then it kind of ended and now you have this thing in stasis. Like, it's just this cycle of people giving it more and more money. So I'm like, you know what you're doing. It's up to you to figure that out. What do you think about this notion that part of what you're describing, because I love what you're describing, like the quadruple A space, which I think would be the logical. Let me back up. Video games have always evolved, as you said, like as a technology, like and gotten more and more complicated. The technologies have become more and more complicated. That will evolve and continue. And I think that the end result of that could be this quadruple A space. That's like the natural place a Naughty Dog would go, or a Rockstar, or something like that. And then the AAA space is kind of just the expensive space, but a space that learns to do more with less. But I've been reading a little bit about this idea, and I've said this before in the past, and I'm happy that I have, because I was kind of early to this idea, this notion that games may be made more like movies in the future. And what I mean by that is, and what other people mean by that is, instead of having a studio like a band or whatever, and you put out an album and then you put out another album and so on and so forth, you just get together for one-offs. And it's like, I want you guys to do the art, and I want this guy to produce. This dude's going to fund it. And that's why you see in movies, and I noticed this for years as a kid, and observed this for years as a kid, where, and then I looked into it and I was like, oh, that is why it is like when you watch movies, there's all these production companies you've never heard of that you'll never hear of again, because it's the LLC or whatever, or the organization of that particular permutation of people that will never work together again, in order to shield themselves from liability on future projects and all of that. They just incorporate and do all of the money in and out of this one company. And of course, there are bigger production companies that go far beyond that, but that's why you see those one-offs. And I feel like the future of gaming could be that, where if you can just find the venture capital, or even a lot of these guys are very wealthy themselves, from the different buyouts and all the different things that have happened. Like, imagine a Pete Hines, who was, as you know, is Bethesda's marketer for many years and left recently. He's many times over rich, So a person like that, and another guy and another guy and another guy willing to put a little bit of their money together and make a one-off thing, kind of feel like that's going to be the future of exploratory, exciting games. And especially because they take so long to make. You can't, how much of your life you're going to dedicate? If you work at Santa Monica Studio, it's like, how much of your life you're going to dedicate to that brand, as opposed to just one of the games and then moving on.
There are elements of that exist today in certain territories. Like, for example, the initiative of Microsoft, who are making Perfect Dark, they were supposed to kind of be like that. They were supposed to be like a sort of a small team, a small core team, and because they built the studio in Santa Monica, or in that area.
Yeah, it's in Santa Monica.
Yeah, specifically I was told, specifically for the contractor culture that exists in that region, where like people come on, they build a game, and then they move on to the next project from a different studio, a different team, different company. But it didn't work for whatever reason, and like not every movie works. Movies get cancelled and stuff, but it didn't work. So the initiative fell back into a very much more traditionalized structure, where you have a leader, Darryl Gallagher, and then working with Crystal Dynamics as a partner, and now it's more like a traditional studio. But I do think it's interesting to think about how that could pan out. I suppose like one of the issues is like, how do you handle royalties? And is there even royalties? Like, I don't know enough about the movie industry to compare it.
Yeah, really. I think you would have to I don't know very much about it either, but I think what these companies do is they find the more, so like when you see the movie and there's like two production companies, and one of them you never heard of them, and one of them is like a huge company. It's like, that's like the distributor, I think. And then you work through them, and you maybe even sell to them. And I don't know enough about it either. I feel like there's got to be more, and I don't mean this literally like freelance culture, but more freelancing between projects. Like, I want to be more nimble and go around. And what's exciting to me is about that potential is like, projects kind of end, games come out, people take their vacations, get away for a little while, and what you would have is all of these things happening at slightly different times, but timelines matching up to get new permutations of people together, which would be great for gaming. But that's like I will say that is the antithesis of what a publisher right now wants. They want to lock their people down as deeply as possible. Sony would never, ever. That is kind of the essence of a second party game in some sense, is like, we don't really give a shit or this is like exploratory and we want to see what's going to happen. Let me ask you this. You had brought up earlier, and I brought this comparison up, so I think you and I are of the same mind, because I say this often, that PlayStation to me this generation has turned into an Apple-like brand, wherein it seems like it doesn't really matter what happens around it. There's just a certain amount of people that are just going to gravitate towards whatever they do. I feel like this is somewhat new to gaming, outside of Nintendo, perhaps. And I'm wondering if you observe that as well, that there seems to be, if I were Xbox especially, I'd be very frustrated because it doesn't seem like the moves we make matter to the extent that they probably would have if they had happened 5 years earlier and really been able to move things more mediocrely. And I know, by the way, I know Phil says about losing the Xbox One, and I get all of that, but I just wonder if you feel like there's a Sony has like crossed this nexus or this event horizon where it's like now it's got the Apple gravity, and so it just kind of sells. Because a lot of people would argue that it doesn't seem to be a differentiator between it and Xbox, even in a serious catalog of games that separates them. And I mean, that's my observation as well. So I'm wondering what you think about that idea.
Well, I mean, kind of. I think like PlayStation has certainly become the default, like Apple's the default in America, and PlayStation is the default for console gaming, but in a way, and I mean this respectfully, it's the wrong question to ask.
Yeah.
Because if you're not growing, it doesn't matter. If the PS5 and the PS6 and the PS7, if all they're doing is selling the same zero profit margin plastic box to the same audience, they're not growing, So they could evaporate Xbox's entire install base tomorrow, and they'd still have this huge problem about where do we find more console gamers. That's the issue that both platforms are having right now. And I think like, even though I think people are defaulting, or when there are more people raising their kids into the PlayStation ecosystem or more, but there's still millions of Xbox players who are digitally locked in. I'm digitally locked in. But on the flip side, like there's plenty of reasons why PlayStation people would never switch to Xbox. I'm digitally locked into Xbox. I couldn't ever consider PlayStation as my default console now, because I've got like 1,000 games on Xbox digitally. There's absolutely nothing Sony could do to make me play PlayStation as my default console. I might pick one up for their exclusives. I'm very jealous of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth as a Final Fantasy VII kid. But at the same time, I know that's coming to PC. So like a lot of the arguments that I've seen thrown at Xbox in the past for like, why do I need an Xbox? I've got a PC. I'm considering that myself. Like Ghost of Tsushima is coming to Steam soon, and I've got an RTX 4080. It's kind of like I'd prefer playing on console, but not enough to the point where I would buy a console just for a few exclusives, knowing that they're going to be available on my PC. So like, I think it goes both ways, and just PlayStation had the luxury of winning the generation you had to win in order to establish yourself as that sort of default. But the problem is the Xbox audience aren't going to sacrifice their install base, their purchases either. So like there's this sort of, the tug of war is ended, kind of. And even though they're the default, I don't think it matters. I don't think it matters.
I don't even think that it. Well, I think that it for me, Jez, it matters and it doesn't. What I think matters actually more than anything is their. And we put a fine point on this on the show, but to reiterate, is like they missed their forecast to sell consoles pretty substantially. They did this while cutting the price of the console pretty substantially on PlayStation, and missing your forecast, which was an ambitious forecast that looked to double the user base in a year. I mean, it's not like it wasn't unambitious, but missed it by 4 million. So you're missing it by like 15%, and you didn't really make very much money, if any money, on the console sales because you cut the price so significantly, especially in certain markets. So I think that there's no doubt that you look at that and you say like, well, what part of this was like over ambition and what part of this was a saturated market? Because PS5 is outselling PS4, but they need to do significantly better than that to as margins. Then they need to spread the field. So I don't know.
PC.
Right. Dude, my audience is I don't want to say my audience. I think most of them don't give a shit, but the vocal part of the audience is not happy with my idea that they need to embrace day and date releases on PC sooner rather than later for single player games, not just multiplayer games. I think the multiplayer thing that die is cast. Like any game that Sony releases in the second or third or first party that's multiplayer is coming to everything, or to both. I shouldn't say everything, to both. But I think that they should even explore that with a big single player game and see what happens there. I think that would be a great way to spread the field without really helping. If you want to look at it as a competitive game where you have these walled gardens all trying to kind of destroy each other or erode each other's ground, it's kind of a neutral move because Steam is not one of the competitors. And I also just think that like Sony,
they are.
Say more.
Steam Deck, man, is like a Trojan horse. It's like it's a PC, but literally nobody boots into Linux. Nobody's gonna put Windows on that thing. You know, nobody's going to install third-party launchers if they can help it. And Blizzard knew this. Like, you could install Battle.net on the Steam Deck, but it was a nightmare. So Blizzard was like, well, we've got to start putting our games onto Steam. You know, they had no choice because Steam has built a console which has both Xboxes and PlayStation's exclusive. And the Steam Deck's only going to get more powerful. It's only going to get more powerful, and it's more convenient than the Xbox, more convenient than PlayStation, and it's similarly priced, and it has all the games. So, like, they've sort of snuck in and kicked Xbox and Sony in the arse and been like, where's your handheld, guys? Which is why, like, I put out an article recently that I believe Microsoft is working on a handheld, and I think they are working on a handheld. There's just so much rumors I'm hearing about handheld that I think Microsoft's working on one. And I think there's rumors that Sony's working on one as well. Mm-hmm. Like a proper handheld, not just a portal. So, you know, Steam, you can only hold one controller in your hand at any one time. You know, you can only I can only play an Xbox or PlayStation or, you know, a Steam Deck at any one time. You know, and it's all the same. It's all the same category. It's all the sort of gaming, entertainment, the gaming relaxation stuff. So the business of gaming has always been about selling games and selling software. And in a universe where we are saturated with software, there's no drought on any platform. There's no drought on Steam, Switch, PlayStation, Xbox. There's not enough pull for me to switch platform. You have to go where people are, you know, and that's why, like, when you look at the duopoly on mobile phones, there's no such thing as exclusive apps. Like, if you make an app for iOS, you have to make it for Android because half your audience is there, and vice versa. You know, these are the consequences of a maturing business, and they resisted it for so long. They resisted acknowledging that it's matured, but this recent wave of inflation and the interest rates and the end of infinite free capital, I think, has just kind of really been a wake-up call for all of these closed platforms. And, you know, Nintendo's going to do Nintendo things, and they'll find growth in movies, opening theme parks and stuff like that. But I don't think theme parks are an option for Xbox and Sony, right?
So I think the Nintendo has access to the whole broad array of cross media. I think Sony's
merchandising and stuff like that.
Right. I think Sony's access is really just through to that space in movies, TV, and maybe music to a lesser degree, but I don't think they have the ability to become, you know, it's like when people ask for PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale 2 or something. It's like, come on, guys. Like, it's not. I really do think,
like, I not to cut you off, but
no, go ahead,
I really it's true that, like, Nintendo has this whole other sort of ideology when it comes to they want to kind of be a Disney sort of a Disney competitor, frankly. And that's why you've seen Disney invest so much in Epic Games, because they're like, oh my God, Nintendo's doing amazing stuff in media and they could be a threat to us because we're nowhere in gaming right now. So like Disney's just like, okay, drop a bag on Fortnite or whatever. Fortnite's big, let's do that, you know. So like you've even got Disney looking at Nintendo as a threat, but for Microsoft and Sony, who are like, they are just software salesmen at the end of the day because they don't make any money on the hardware or very little. Um, I really do think the future for these platforms is just crack crack them open, be more like the Steam Deck, because Steam's got your exclusives, both of your exclusives now. It's got all your Xbox games, all your PlayStation games, Ghost of Tsushima, sitting side by side with Master Chief on one store that is not a closed platform, but might as well be because it's Linux. You know, um, that's the future of the industry. And Steam's Trojan horse their way into it. It's quite amazing, really. So I think like your audience and well, aspects of your audience and aspects of my audience and the sort of the people our age who do not. I think it genuinely comes from a place of like we don't want to see consoles die because this is the way we want to play games. Like I say, I've got a gaming PC right here. I don't really like using it for gaming. I like using my Xbox. I like sitting with a controller. I like having it separate. So like, I got my Xbox running here and I've got my podcast stuff separate, so I can do both without it causing complications on the low end. But I don't see how they go from here without like some kind of campaign to find completely new gamers. And I think like you have this conflict between like I try putting like non-gaming family and friends on a video game and they just can't wrap their head around the dual thumbstick motion. How do you overcome that hurdle with the generation who've only played on phones and tablets and stuff like that?
It's wild because that particular technology goes in both directions where like my parents are in their 70s and they have no idea what to do with those sticks. And then, you go lower where they never had to deal with the sticks either. And it's like this very generational thing. But once you overcome that hurdle, that's what I always say to people. Like, if you can just figure it out, it'll work. It'll be universal for you and you'll understand it completely.
Exactly.
But
how do you, but we want that. But so they have to give us that. But how do you attract the new users who don't get that today? I don't think Xbox and Sony do enough work there either. But.
Yeah, that's true enough. Because I agree with you. I love handheld gaming too. Because I grew up a Nintendo kid before PlayStation existed. I was obsessed with Nintendo, and I was obsessed with Nintendo through probably into the early Wii period. I just always loved PlayStation as well, and PlayStation now is really the only system that I play on. But I do look at the cumulative number of consoles being sold, including Switch, and how well Switch 2 is no doubt going to do. I do see some promise in the sense that while maybe not growing the way like a capitalist would want it to grow, and I understand that that's like intrinsic to the survival of games. Nonetheless, I feel like there are enough people willing to spend money and buy games, and that we're going to say goodbye to console gaming, but not console style gaming. What I mean by that is, we're still going to play on a TV with a controller in our hand in 10 or 15 years. It's just maybe going to be PlayStation as an app, or maybe a small PSTV style deck of, I don't have my PlayStation TV here. I did for a long time, and now I don't, now that I could use it as a prop, like a small deck of cards style thing that's so small that allows you to relay with whatever you need. And I don't know. I think there's enough of us. Right. Yeah.
No, you're right. There are enough of us that the business sustains itself, but a publicly traded company, that's not enough for them. They'll be like, okay, we'll have this sustainable business over here. We'll milk these guys forever. Kind of like World of Warcraft, right? World of Warcraft's been going for 20 years, hasn't grown. It's static, pretty much. It's never reached the heights of the Wrath of the Lich King era. But it's like they've never shut it down because it's fine. It's fine that the way it is. There's still millions of paying players. They make it sustainable, and they're fine with that, But to find the growth that the capitalists want, they need to do more things, which is why you end up with Diablo Immortal, Hearthstone, card packs, gacha, gambling, that kind of stuff. And that's where the growth comes from. And I think, honestly, I think Sony and Microsoft, they will keep console gaming. And I honestly don't even think it'll be an app, because it's more expensive unless there's some kind of clean energy breakthrough in the next 10 years. It's cheaper to let someone run the cloud server in their house with your own electricity than it is to stream it over the cloud. The business model of xCloud just doesn't make any sense today. It's more expensive, and there's no microtransactions because Apple and Google block it. So it's like they're not making any money on it. They just sort of got a foot in the door for a potential energy breakthrough one day that makes it really cheap to do, and a regulatory breakthrough that forces Apple and Google to let them monetize that shit. Because right now they don't, which is why PlayStation Plus, I don't think it's even on mobile, if I remember correctly, right? I think it's only on PC.
Yeah, PlayStation Plus is just console centric.
And but like the PlayStation Plus cloud, that's only on PC and PlayStation, right? So they never brought it to mobile because it's pointless. It's pointless because Apple and Google block the microtransactions, which would at least go some way into making it a viable business model. Microsoft's just like, we don't care, we've got infinite money, whatever. But it's not a viable business option right now. It's cheaper to just let people run the server in their house, which is basically what an Xbox or a PlayStation is at this point.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
But so I think there'll always be consoles, much like there'll always be World of Warcraft. I know there's going to be World of Warcraft like in the next 20 years. They've come out and said, yeah, we've got the next 3 expansions planned already. So they're already planning for like the next 8 years of World of Warcraft, knowing full well it's not going to grow. And the same is probably true for Xbox and PlayStation. They've probably got like at least 2 more console generations mapped out. Unless there's some kind of energy breakthrough, the cloud's never going to be a thing. But they do need the growth, and I think the growth is why they're going to have to look beyond what we prefer as the gaming paradigm, and that is things like handhelds, mobile, other rival consoles, because the business is selling those units, the software and the digital at the moment.
Yeah, I thought there was a lot of surprising candor when Sony was talking about the Portal, which I think is awesome. Like I fucking love that thing. Just in my house, just it's perfect during football season, during hockey games, whatever. But they were basically like, dude, it's an engagement machine. Like, we don't want you to basically pick up your phone and start fucking with it. We need to give you some other thing. Like, it is all about just keeping eyeballs and keeping people attracted to the content, generally speaking. And you said a lot there.
I want PSP, man.
What about the PSP?
No, PSVR. I had a PSVR, and it was my savior at one point because for some reason my laptop was broken and I lost my phone, and I was like, oh well, the only thing I've got that connects to the internet is the PSVR. So I was there rocking the PSVR with YouTube and stuff. I became really fond of that thing.
Yeah, I loved the Vita. I mean, the disappointing thing, I guess, from a developer standpoint, from my studio standpoint, is like we did really, comparably pretty well on Vita. We wish that they left it alive just for people like us to want to release more games for it, because you can sell 10 or 20,000 copies of a game on Vita, which is great. And we loved it. But once it got cracked open in 2016, it was over. And they were trying ever since then to kill it. And I think it lasted a lot longer than they wanted it to. So the word is that, yeah, there's another handheld maybe in the works, and I'll be interested in seeing how that plays out. I'll be very interested to see how an Xbox handheld looks too. I think that's just so. Yeah, there have been rumors of an Xbox handheld since the PSP. It's like everyone's always wanted one, and so
I'm actually like, even though there's all this turmoil and stuff, I'm really excited about the future of console gaming. I'm really excited to see what they will do with their backs against the wall. And it's like, well, and initially I was kind of like, I had this really negative reaction to Microsoft's strategy, which was to put their games on other platforms. And I had a pretty public negative reaction to it. I wrote an article about it. Xbox fans are right to be angry about this, because my mentality was, this is Microsoft doing it in an unthoughtful way, in a way that's going to create this downward spiral for the console hardware. And people are going to be like, well, what's the point of having an Xbox when I can get everything on PlayStation anyway? But then I realized like that's the ship sailed on that already, because that's what Steam is. And Steam goes even further, because now it's giving me PlayStation, Xbox, and PC games. The only thing you can't get on Steam is Nintendo, which is hilarious, right? So maybe
Yeah.
it'll end up being like there's only Nintendo and Steam left.
Yeah, Nintendo will be the least likely, I think, to thank God their software sells so well.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about in the back half of our conversation here. Let's talk a little bit about Xbox specifically and pick your brain about things that I'm curious about. I guess the easiest way to do this, because I have a few questions I wanted to ask you, but they all kind of go together, and it's all in what I feel like what has happened in quotes to Xbox, and I wonder if you think it's accurate or not. So I'll present it to you. Is that, let's just fast forward to the PS5 Xbox Series generation. Things aren't really going great for Xbox, I don't think, comparably. They absorb Bethesda, I think, with the intention of making most of their games exclusive. They made a bet on Game Pass that I think is, and I've said this many, many times on Sacred, that I think is smart, simply from the perspective of, we're losing the game as it's predicated. We need to change the rules of the game. And that's what you do. And so I think that like Game Pass, especially when you feel like the impetus of it in 2015, 2016 rolls out, 17, 18 becomes this thing, whatever, that's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Look at Netflix, look at Amazon Prime, look at, everyone loves subscriptions. That's actually a pretty good idea. And then I think in order to satiate that, there were unintended consequences that started to injure them. I do think that fewer people buy games on Xbox. This causes publishers not to want to put games necessarily on Xbox, because if they don't get on Game Pass, maybe they won't get as much notice, which is the case for most of the games that don't come to Xbox. Most of them are not paid to not come. And then I also think the Activision deal is, to me, looks like a be careful what you wish for sort of situation, where there was this unintended consequence that I never really even looked at, because I looked at it at Jez as like, okay, they're absorbing all of this development cost. These games are obviously coming to everything, like Activision games. Like, you can't absorb this stuff and then make it exclusive. That's not the idea. But I think it had this unintended consequence that's even worse, which is there's now so much money being churning through Xbox that people at the company at large that never cared about Xbox are now paying very deep attention to it. And this is I don't want to say too many cooks, but more cooks than you're used to in the kitchen situation now at Xbox, where I'm sure the idea of putting Xbox games on PlayStation and Switch is an external idea. And I feel like in other words, I guess what I would present to you, Jez, is that they made good choices to try to buttress their decision on Game Pass, but they kind of flew too close to the sun. And they're overextended. So now the only way out of it is to put games on other platforms in some ironic way, especially because the console is being outsold so significantly by PlayStation 5. So do you feel like there's any accuracy in my assessment on the situation over the last few years?
I think there are elements of truth there. I mean, you've got to think of it this way, right? Microsoft had to do something. You're completely right that Game Pass was about changing the rules, right? But even without that, Sony is dominating, but they still only have the 8% margin, which I know Microsoft ain't happy with the 8% margin. They've killed divisions for less than that. And I do think Microsoft, you're right, that they are scrutinizing this stuff. And of course they are, more so than ever, potentially, because of this. But at the same time, the alternative is to copy Sony's strategy to the letter and lead them down to 8% margin, which for them isn't enough. So I think like they would have probably have done this anyway, and they would have been forced to do this anyway, just because of the way that mobile has gradually changed the rules of how people perceive gaming revenue, and it is the rise of these black hole games, which they've started calling them. It's the rise of things like Genshin Impact, which of course Sony has, but Microsoft doesn't. But Genshin Impact, like I think I can't remember if it was Genshin Impact or Honkai Star Rail, but one of them recently announced 200 million players. 200 million
Yeah,
players.
it must be Genshin because that's the older one, right?
Yeah, and it's just like these are like unimaginable numbers. That's like almost as big as the entire console install base.
Mhm.
I'm just gonna double check that because that sounds ridiculous to me right now. And I'm just like, was that really what they said? Um, maybe I'm getting that number wrong because that sounds ridiculous to me. But it was a lot of play, basically. 200 million monthly active users, Genshin Impact. Let's see what comes up.
Yeah.
Okay, so no, I did get that wrong. That's Hoyoverse has 200 million.
So all
players.
I mean, that's okay. So
that's still a lot for like a few, just like 3 or 4 games, right?
Right. So it's really still makes the point pretty.
Yeah, 63 million players play Genshin Impact monthly, which is an obscene amount of people.
Yeah, that's more than our PlayStation 5s.
Yeah, it's an obscene amount of money being spent too, because it's all gambling, and it's like, oh man, I can have one more gacha pull. It's just and it's a little bit of money here and a little bit of money there, and it just adds up, and it's a license to print money, and and I don't play these kind of games, but it's what millions and millions of people want, is this sort of familiarity and this convenience, and it's to the point where it's like they won't even consider trying something else in the same way that we might try something else, being of a certain age group and proclivity. So I think it's a coalescence of different things. It's Microsoft's admission that chasing the PlayStation business model, which they've been doing since Xbox was born, basically, that's not going to work for them, and that, in fact, if they keep doing it, it's going to hurt them, because PlayStation's business model is probably hurting PlayStation, which is what the CEO was talking about in his last investor call. And for all the successes that PlayStation has had in recent years, he's still out there saying things like, we need to rethink aspects of our business, and he's not talking about Xbox or Game Pass and stuff like that. He's talking about the rise of mobile and people just not even considering console as an option. The iPad kids and stuff like that, right? So I think there is some element of truth where Xbox is having a lot more scrutiny about its business model, but I think this would have happened regardless. I think this would have eventually happened irrespective of whether or not they'd competed like 50-50 instead of 75-20%, 25% against PlayStation. I think this would have happened anyway, because Microsoft has been saying for years that their North Star is meeting every gamer where they are. That's what they've been saying for years and years and years. It's 2 billion gamers this, 2 billion gamers that. You don't reach 2 billion gamers with a console. You just don't. It's not possible, for whatever reason. I'm sure they've got data on or sentiment tracking on why people don't want to buy a console, too expensive, or they just can't figure out the thumbsticks or whatever it is. But this has been Microsoft's goal since forever. If you've been listening to them, paying attention to them, and in the weeds like I have, it's like, I suppose, psychologically surprising in a sort of like, oh my god, they're going on the competition thing. But when you look at things like the Steam Deck having everything, and Microsoft buying Minecraft, and like all of this stuff completely lines up with the way the trajectory that Xbox has been on since Phil Spencer took the lead and Satya Nadella became the CEO. He's a software guy, he's a cloud guy, he's not a hardware guy. The hardware has always been sort of like incidental. They do Surface, they do some stuff, but it's always been about selling software and going where people are. And that was such a stark difference to Steve Ballmer and the Steve Ballmer era of Microsoft, where it was like, we'll never put Office on iPhone and stuff like that. Satya Nadella came in and was like, nope, Office on iPhone. And now like Office is ridiculously huge, facing antitrust probes in the European Union for being so dominant. And And they look at things like Office and Cloud and Windows and just being like, well, less so Windows, but like things like Office and Microsoft 365 and Azure, and it's like the recurring theme with all these bigger divisions of the company is that their content is everywhere. So Activision was about putting content everywhere. Candy Crush, Warcraft, Hearthstone, Call of Duty Warzone Mobile, which again is like this black hole kind of game. And then like looking at things like Sea of Thieves and being like, the next 10 million Sea of Thieves players, they'll never come from Xbox because it's not growing fast enough. And by the time that Sea of Thieves, the ship might have sailed. Pirates, right? Yeah, the ship might have sailed. It might be too late to put it on PlayStation and get an extra 10 million players. Maybe there'll be a Sea of Thieves ripoff that's 10 times better. Maybe they thought Skull and Bones was going to be that, and they were like, "Oh God, Skull and Bones! It's a quadruple A game. We need to get Sea of Thieves on PlayStation right now, or we'll never get that 10 million extra players or whatever they're going to get." So there's a lot of maths, just mathing here, I think. But I think what will be really telling, right, is to see how Sony handles the next few years, because Sony's going to start doing day and date on PC, just like Microsoft did. Sony sort of started doing the subscription stuff a little bit more aggressively after Microsoft did, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if one day we see Helldivers 2 hit Xbox and because they'll be looking at Destiny and be like, can you imagine what would happen? Because Destiny is one of the most played games on Xbox. I know Xbox isn't as big as PlayStation, but it's like that's still millions of players.
Mm-hmm.
And it's similarly like if they made Call of Duty exclusive and took it off PlayStation, that would kill the business model and the cash flow and all the devs. That whole business model set up to be on PlayStation. But similarly with Destiny, you take it off Xbox, the whole business model is set up with account of the fact that there are this many Xbox players. They could probably look at Helldivers one day and be like, we could make so much more money if we just put this on Xbox as well. So much free money. All the shooter players are on Xbox, the shooter box, right? And maybe what you do is you launch Helldivers 2 up against Gears of War 6. Outcompete Gears of War on Microsoft's own system,
Yeah,
I've got to be thinking about some of this stuff.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree. Like we've discussed in the past, like how does Sony see this going? Because I made the point using Pentiment as an example. And by the way, man, I was so annoyed. I don't know if Pentiment's doing well or not on PlayStation and Switch. I have no idea.
Probably not.
but it is annoying to me that people were like circulating, like, look at the PSN profiles numbers for Pentiment. I'm like, dude, PSN profiles is a fucking opt-in service that will show that Helldivers has like 50,000 players, so it's not really relevant. We have no idea how it's doing. I think it's more clear that Sea of Thieves is doing really well because of the pre-order kind of rankings. But I know for myself, I bought Pentiment out of curiosity. I have not played it yet, but my wife bought it on Switch and beat it. So there's two there. But I was making the point that unfortunately for Microsoft, so like things that might not look great for them is $20 game, right? You would get usually $14 from that sale, but you're actually really getting $8 because you have to subsume the $6 that your competitor's getting, and that kind of narrows itself out to like an $8 profit, right? Free and clear. And I look at that and I'm like, that's dangerous. This is exactly what Phil Spencer himself said, right? In that famous quote about we give them 30% and then they use it to foreclose on us. It's like, well, yeah. And this is going to become more extreme because this is actually a heightened 30% where really Microsoft's only getting 40%, right? If you kind of clear out those 30% rips for each of them. So I think that there's something interesting there. And then I think the other problem, and I wanted to ask you about this, was I think it's kind of, let's not even talk about profitability or how the numbers are counted or anything like that, unless you want to. I'm not interested in this with Game Pass, but I think based on the numbers released to Tom Warren, that Game Pass is totally flat for years, it seems like. And And I'm wondering if you read the numbers the same way, and what do you make of that? Because I think the one thing that might, Jez, that we haven't really touched on that might really be spurring Microsoft's decisions from my point of view is that this isn't going the way they thought it was going to go. Not to say that there's not money to be made there, not to say that they can't make a profit there, any of that. But when you see from Circana, only 10% of American dollars spent on subscriptions for both sides, you're like, this isn't, they thought this was going to subsume a major portion of the economy in gaming, and it hasn't. So while they can keep it going, they kind of have to swing back. But I think the problem here is that they've trained at least a major portion of their audience to wait for games to come to Game Pass. And I think this somehow connects. I was reading some of your tweets. You were tweeting about the new Monster Hunter game not coming to Xbox, which I think is interesting.
I'm so pissed about that.
I just don't really understand that either. And by the way, you were saying Monster Hunter World before. It's like, that's 25 million copies sold across all platforms. Incredible success story. But I think that you're kind of seeing the fruit of this strategy playing out on the back end, where even companies like that are like, I think that people think it's as easy as just porting your game over. And as someone who co-owns a game studio, a small indie studio, it's not trivial, but it's not only that. It's that you open up another pipeline that you have to constantly update your game and watch it and make sure it works. And it's a lot of, and so if companies go and say, like, we're only going to sell like 25,000 copies of this game or whatever they think, they might be like, it's not even really worth it, because we have to ESRB rate it, and we have to do all these kinds of things, and we have to send it through cert. We have to have like a producer on our end dealing with it. We have to have people making all the button assets, and it's not as trivial as you think. And so I'm wondering if you think that all of that lines up. In other words, Game Pass seems flat. It's going to be a part of their business, but it's not going to be the major driver of their business. It can't be moving forward. And that it is kind of had this ramification of teaching people, I think reasonably so. I've long said Game Pass is a fucking steal. If you're playing on Xbox and you're not on Game Pass, you're kind of dumb, in my opinion. But that doesn't make a viable economy, and now you're kind of seeing the fruits of the games not coming. What do you think of that?
I think, like, there are some assumptions in there, because when they did their Xbox business update, they did say they're seeing double-digit growth on Game Pass for cloud and PC. That's Game Pass Ultimate, pretty much. And so it does sound like it is still growing, even if it's slow, potentially. But again, it's like, let's assume it's flat, because I'm sure if it was growing really well, Microsoft would release the numbers, right? And I do think there is a consequence of Game Pass with certain publishers, Capcom being one of them. Exoprimal, Path of the Goddess, Resident Evils, Monster Hunter Rise, all of those launched into Game Pass. Or not Resident Evil. It didn't launch in, but it came later, right? Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 were on Game Pass. Resident Evil 7 was on Game Pass. I don't know if Resident Evil 8's been on Game Pass yet. Maybe not. But Monster Hunter Rise, Path of the Goddess, Exoprimal, they all launched into Game Pass. And Path of the Goddess is launching into Game Pass in the future. So, like, it's almost like Microsoft maybe either wasn't aware of Monster Hunter Stories, or they thought, we don't want to throw any Game Pass money at this. And then Capcom was like, well, we're not going to make any money then if you're not going to give us a Game Pass for Monster Hunter Stories. Therefore, we're not going to port it to Xbox, because we want the Game Pass money for everything that isn't a Resident Evil or a Monster Hunter mainline franchise, right? Monster Hunter Wilds isn't launching into Game Pass, and these are Resident Evil, but those will sell because they're huge brands, right? Monster Hunter Stories is a spin-off, turn-based, Pokemon-ish kind of game, which actually was a mobile game originally. I think was it on 3DS or something, or Switch, the original one? I can't remember. But it's awesome, and I love it. And I'm so upset that it's not coming to Xbox. Microsoft probably tearing their hair out. Like, oh my god, we get all these JRPGs like Grandia for fuck's sakes coming.
Yeah, I was actually interested to see that was coming, but that's and physical.
Yeah, physical too. It's like, we've got Grandia, we've got Persona, and now Jez is bitching about Monster Hunter fucking Stories, for God's sake. But the thing is, these discussions about they're training their audience not to buy games. People used to say this about Steam and Steam sales, and be like, well, I'm going to wait for a Steam sale. I'm going to wait for a Steam sale. And I've actually spoken to people at Microsoft about this specific point. Like, I think I spoke to them last June about it at the Xbox event. And I was like, I can't remember which specific person I spoke to, but what they explained to me was their sort of North Star metric is monthly active users, right? Monthly active users is the most important thing. And Xbox Game Pass is a vehicle to potentially get more monthly active users because users checking out Game Pass, that counts as engagement, right? And you can measure the way Microsoft measures monthly active users by, and it's kind of telling, but in the Microsoft Rewards app, it has a bunch of activities for you to do, right? And it's all activities that they find to be valuable to them, which is stuff like try a game out, browse a catalog, blah 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 blah. And the idea is it's almost like trickle down economics in a way. It's kind of like the more monthly active users you get, if that's just your North Star, no matter what you're doing, get more monthly active users, you will get whales who spend tons of money on your system. And the more time you have them on the store and the more reasons you give them to look into the apps and do all this stuff, potentially that's going to lead to sales and users who will spend a lot of money, even if like a bunch of people don't. Like the vast majority of Genshin Impact players have probably never spent a penny on the game. But then you get people who spend like $30,000 in a month on the game, which is really what the kind of user they want, right? So I do think Game Pass is like, it's an interesting sort of paradigm. And one of the big issues that revolves around Game Pass discussions and debates is the fact that we don't have a full spreadsheet that really breaks down in a granular way how well it's doing. Like people say to me, it's doing well, right? And that's as much data as I can get. And then we get sort of like every few years we get like maybe a milestone update. It's got this many users, that many users, whatever. Or we get like a hint or during a podcast that it's got double digit growth. Double digit could mean 10%, could mean 99%. Where does it fall? Like if it experienced 99% growth, that's great. If you experience 10% growth year over year or month over month or whatever it is that so great? I don't know. So there's a ton of speculation there. But I think like the fact that they keep doing it, and one of the big rumors and speculations about the business update was like they were going to announce that they were going to end day one games because of this idea that, or this thought process that in order to make the money back on losing those retail sales from things like Starfield, they are going to have to bring games to PlayStation so that can be the retail arm. And that Xbox is the subscription arm of their business model, right? But they were like, no, we're still doing day one Game Pass. And then Phil Spencer did an interview not a few days after saying the plan is to still bring Call of Duty to Game Pass, which is like, that's the kicker, because it's like that could really upend the business model for Call of Duty, like we were talking about earlier. Imagine if like every single Call of Duty player, instead of spending $70 on the game, they just spent $10 on the game to get a month of Game Pass, if that, $1 on the game, get a new account or whatever. But those are extreme scenarios. Or maybe they subscribe to Game Pass and remain a subscriber to Game Pass forever, for what, and then they go from Game Pass and they check out other games, which virally markets other games for other publishers. And it becomes a sort of virtuous cycle, which is what they hope it can be, this sort of win-win-win scenario for publisher, consumer, Microsoft, where Microsoft gets its unique selling point, publishers get free marketing engagement virality, similarly to the way that you artificially inflate numbers when you do Twitch sponsorship or whatever. And then, I think Sea of Thieves is a really great example of a game that was helped by Game Pass to find its audience, and then from that you got like, all this other stuff, subscriptions and whatever, and also you can potentially use the money that you do make from Game Pass, which is a substantial amount of money month over month. If there are like, what was it, 25 million users? I can't remember off the top of my head.
It's like, something like that for the
that's millions and millions of dollars, and you can use that to acquire content that perhaps might skip your system, like Monster Hunter Stories. If otherwise you wouldn't have that money. So I think until they fundamentally change what Game Pass is and what it does, we have to assume, in my view, that it is doing what it's meant to be doing. You know, they're still bringing games out day one. They're still adding cool new stuff to it. I think NBA 2K24 just dropped in there randomly or something. I think that's coming to PS Plus as well, actually. I mean, there's a ton of games that are still coming to Game Pass, so it doesn't seem to me like it's slowing down. But I can see why people might think, Control just hit there as well, coming soon. SpongeBob, Paw Patrol. Paw Patrol's big deal, apparently. Bolt Gun.
Yeah, for kids. I mean, I think getting those kids games is great, especially if you have a latent Game Pass subscription you just have every month or whatever. Then that's why I think Game Pass is a great value. I wonder.
It does feel too good to be true.
So yeah, I mean, it definitely. I think in some ways it is like that. That was my. A lot of people get mad at me about this, but my contention is that they're not really being transparent with how they're.
I wish they would be.
Well, it's like when they say like we're running a profit on Game Pass. It's like I believe you, and my audience is like, I know we know the argument, but just to reiterate it here, I believe you with money in, money out. But I don't think you're counting, and by you I mean like the Microsoft, the royal you at Microsoft, the business. I don't think it's counting. All right, so you make Starfield. You would have this assumption. It's like a several $100 million game or whatever. You have this assumption it's going to sell X amount of copies, except for you're entering it into Game Pass. So it's going to not sell nearly as many copies as it did. So what does that look like? And then you have to multiply that out by all of your games. And I don't think that those numbers are necessarily represented in a holistic way. And I guess I would say that them bringing games over to other platforms is almost a tacit, like admittance that that's not working the way that they thought.
I will say this. I spoke to a studio head at Xbox a while ago, and they expressed frustration to me that Microsoft has targets for them, and they feel like the fact that the games are on Game Pass and the games aren't on PlayStation makes it difficult to hit the targets they're setting. So I think there's some frustration from studios there, and I think Pentiment might be an example of a studio being like, we really want this to be multi-platform because our argument is you're giving us performance targets and forcing us to hold one arm behind our back. So like maybe Microsoft, I think it is on Microsoft to explain to if they even care about these kind of discussions and this speculation, like whether it's random podcasters or investors potentially. I think it is on Microsoft should explain how they reconcile those things, And I do think we have seen some pushback to that. I do think games like Pentiment going to PlayStation do represent the idea that a studio head or heads are. There probably is frustration that it's like, well, our targets are this many retail copies, but you're forcing us to put the game on Game Pass. You're not letting us put the game on PlayStation when it easily could be. So, and because, studios, they're not beholden to Xbox, especially the acquired studios. They have their own culture, and a lot of them come from a multi-platform background. They just want more people playing their games, right? And I do think, like, you've started seeing Microsoft do things like pay extra money for 4 days early access, which is kind of like, the FOMO books thing, and all publishers have started doing that as well. But I do think like Starfield and Forza Motorsport did that, where it was like pay early and get a week early access. EA and Ubisoft do that too now.
I don't like it. I don't like it out the top. I don't like them doing it but it hasn't hit a game yet that I'd be very eager to play, so I want to reserve judgment until I have to say no.
I did it for Diablo. I bought Diablo 3 times, man. I bought a PC version. I bought an Xbox version. I bought the collector's edition, which I still got the copy of it.
That's funny.
It's so bad. I'm the downfall of the gaming industry, man. But
you might be holding it up. You might be holding it up on your own shoulders like Atlas.
Yeah,
sounds like.
There are some games I'll do that for. Diablo's one of them, right? But yeah, I agree with you, and I completely see why. You know, a lot of what seems like it just doesn't make sense, right? But if I can get the game for free, why would I pay for it? You know, but like I did buy Diablo 3 times, knowing that Microsoft was probably going to put Diablo into Game Pass someday, and it is coming to Game Pass in 2 weeks, I think. But there's no FOMO way in hell that I was going to wait for that. So I'm sort of like that. I represent that sort of like I'm in the ecosystem because I like it and I like what it gives me. I like Xbox Play Anywhere a lot, and it's got all it's got my classic Xbox 360 games that I like and that I bought because I went digital really early, and it was so much fun seeing my 360 digital games, which were pretty much mothballed on my 360, which is in the cupboard or in a drawer. It was so much fun seeing those light up on my Xbox when they were doing backwards compatibility. It's like, oh, Max Payne 3 works. Oh, all these other games.
From a services perspective, I think Xbox has done a really nice job with backwards compatibility, with giving added value to. Well, Sony has to hire external studios to port PS2 games one at a time, basically. So it's
tough for what they've. You know,
and PS3 is even worse. I mean, we don't get anything on PS3 because it's so fucked.
Yeah, the whole cell thing.
Yeah,
I'm still hoping for Metal Gear Solid 4, man. I had a PS3. My brother had a PS3, and I had my only PS3 game was Metal Gear Solid 4. I love that game.
That'll be in the volume 2, right, of the
volume
Metal
2,
Gear collection. Yeah.
I hope so. Yeah.
All right. So one last question as we wrap up, Jez, I wanted to ask you about was specifically about these 4 games and like what we might learn about why these 4 games were chosen and what games may come in the future. I know your reporting says that there's nothing in the works or that you know about right now beyond these 4 games. I would relatively believe that because I think that they would want to see how everything did and like what directions they should go in. But I look at this hodgepodge of games other than being newer and smaller and a little bit older. Hi-Fi Rush is a little newer, but we have 2 Obsidian games, right? So that's interesting. And then you have Tango. And I have my own weird theories about why they might want their game in there. I was saying on the show, it's like it's probably somewhat rough to be a domestic developer of games where no one plays your game, or you have a very small audience of people in your home country that play your game. Like that would bum me out, and I would think that there would be like an exception made for them regardless in some sense. But I had a theory there. But then you have Sea of Thieves doing really well on pre-order charts, and seems like there's a lot of excitement around that around PlayStation. And then you have something smaller like Grounded, like we said. So what do we take of these 4 games, and what do you suspect would be like game 5 or game 6?
Well, I mean, for starters, yeah, I like when Microsoft said at the thing, don't expect more than 4 games. We're not working on right now. They were telling the truth, you know, and but they also left the door open because I think like they predict that. I think what they're going slowly because they want to see if this does affect monthly active users, which is their North Star metric. Their North Star metric is monthly active users. And if this does negatively impact monthly active users, they might not do it. But if it doesn't, and I think they believe it's not going to impact monthly active users on console specifically, that is, then yeah, I think they will do more than 4. And for my money, I wouldn't bet against Microsoft here. I think like it probably won't impact monthly active users, and Microsoft at least now. And I think they'll just be like, yeah, we'll do the go ahead. Like I said on Twitter that Hellblade 2 is not being worked on for PlayStation 5 right now. That was very specifically debunked to me by a very good source, who's never steered me wrong, and likes debunking things. But at the same time, I could see Hellblade 2 eventually coming to PlayStation 5 because Hellblade 1 was there and there's a legacy of Hellblade on PlayStation. And if I'm Ninja Theory, I would rather more people see my game. And if I'm Microsoft, I'd rather my studio be happy, you know. Especially like if it's 2 or 3 years down the line, when all those sales are sort of fizzled out on Xbox and PC, right? So yeah, when it comes to more than four, I do think there'll be more than four down the line. I think Hellblade could be one of them, even though they're not working on it right now. And I think like you've got to look at some of the studios they've acquired potentially. I think like I could see maybe not Avowed, but I could see the Outer Worlds 2, you know, because
Hmm.
again, it's got the legacy and makes sense. But maybe even Avowed because Pillars of Eternity and you know they've Hi-Fi Rush is there, which also makes sense. I don't think you're gonna see is Halo.
Really interesting.
I
Yeah, I was going to
don't.
ask you about that,
Yeah,
about more of the legacy products, because that's more where
yeah.
my mind is. So you feel like this is a non-starter, like Master Chief Collection or something like that, or a Gears
Yeah,
Collection.
I don't think you're gonna see. Yeah, I don't think you're gonna see Gears. I don't think you're gonna see Halo, and I don't think you're gonna see Forza. I think Microsoft does want to have permanent exclusives, and that's kind of been hinted to me, at least under this current regime, that they do want to have iconic Xbox associated franchises in the same way that Halo is to Xbox what Mario is to Nintendo,
Mhm.
right? But I do think you're going to see a future version of Halo that has this sort of mobile component where it's like it works on mobile as well. Similar to Call of Duty Warzone, where it's like they just announced that Call of Duty Warzone Mobile has the same progression system on mobile that it does on PC and does on console. I think they'll do that, um, but I don't think you'll see Halo on PlayStation. But I think pretty much, I don't think you'll see Fable on PlayStation. I think they want that to be. I think they see that as an iconic franchise to associate, and I think they see Starfield as that as well. I think they want to associate Starfield with Xbox. So I do think there is a category of game within Microsoft where it's like these are the games that we are associating with the Xbox brand. But I could be wrong. It's also a
Yeah,
prediction.
it's
So
interesting. I thought about it in the I'd trust your instincts, because I thought about it in the totally opposite direction, where I was like, because you're talking about Hellblade and all and Avowed, and I'm like, no way, man. Like we don't, none of our new games, like um I would, like, to me, I would be like, we have maximally tapped out Halo Master Chief Collection. Now let's go sell literally 5 million copies of it on PlayStation. Like
sure, it's very
especially if you
tempting
release it
for
on
them.
PS4 and PS5, you'd have a game that would sell millions of copies. And if you let them all be on out there a la carte, Halo 1, 2, 3, Reach, whatever, you might, it's like, I don't, so from my mind, I was like, damn,
Makes a lot of sense.
that's free money. And meanwhile, we keep the new Halo games to our console. We, and I love what you said about keeping studios happy, because it seems to me like, I'm just reading this from the outside. I know Pete Hines, for instance, a little bit, but I don't know him well enough to be able to really read him like this. But I'm like, I don't feel like people are happy at Bethesda. Like there seems to be like a discontentment about them being locked down. And so I looked at that and I was like, it seems like Starfield would be more likely than like an Avowed. But I love your argument about protecting the legacy brands and making sure people know that they can always get these things there. But the other side of the seesaw on that is just that that's where the most upside is in sales, in my opinion. Like that's just free money. And from
I
a
think
huge group of people that had never had the option to buy these games, and would do it out of sheer curiosity, which is kind of what I think is happening with Hi-Fi Rush, and kind of what I think has happened with Pentiment in some sense. Like, um, although we'll probably never get numbers of those games, so we have to just look at the sales charts and kind of glean what we can from them.
I think you're absolutely right. That it just makes sense when you look at the math, you know. And Microsoft's probably sitting there like, Halo Master Chief would sell ridiculous amounts on PlayStation, but what kind of damage would that potentially do
Right.
to the common sense, like in your mind's eye, for the general public? What would that do to the Xbox brand? Most people don't even know what Hellblade is, probably. So that's probably no big deal to them. But like stuff like Halo, Gears, and Forza, I think are heavily associated with the Xbox brand. And I think like they would be, at least in the current regime, nervous about breaking that seal. Um, but that's the current regime, right?
Right.
And I think you're right that there are people at some of the acquired studios who aren't happy about being Xbox exclusive, and there's probably like certain individuals which are upholding that ethos, you know, and it's kind of like, and I think this is a lot of Xbox fans think of it like you've knocked a brick out of a dam, knocked a brick out a wall of a dam, right? because all of it just does kind of make sense, right? It's like, why not Starfield? Why not Halo?
Right. You could make an argument from many different angles for every game, which is, and that I think as an Xbox fan or just an Xbox consumer is going to be the most annoying part. If you're one, which is everything is now going to be, well, I'll just wait, or when is this coming? And for the newer stuff, it's funny because the only games that I feel somewhat newer games from Xbox, from my point of view, that I feel confident will be multi-platform are Indiana Jones, which I think will eventually come over. And I think it's already obvious that Blade game is going to be multi-platform. I think that was obvious since they announced it, but I don't think those are Microsoft's choices. Like, I think those have to, and the reason I have that theory is just because from the Insomniac leak, we know that the Marvel is changing the rules of how things work and how many copies things have to sell. And there's just no chance if they're getting comparable deals to Spider-Man that they're going to sell enough copies on Xbox. This is not happening. So, those are the two games that I think are most reasonable. But you know what, Jez, what I was really excited about was to see Peter Moore, I think, gave an interview with someone recently, and he said, oh yeah, they were like, oh, the conversations about Halo coming to PlayStation. And he's like, yeah, they were having those conversations like many years ago. And I was like, I fucking reported that. I knew someone in the room and everyone called me a liar. And and everyone's like, that wasn't true. That's fucking nonsense. And I'm like, no, I knew someone in the room talk. And what it was specifically about was Master Chief Collection coming to PS4. This was when I was still at IGN. And I read that and I was like, yes, I fucking told you. They were talking about it. So they've always had this idea in their mind. And to me, that melds with the Microsoft that I know as a consumer and the view I have of them as a consumer, because I use a Windows laptop and when I'm on Windows right now on my desktop. So I like Microsoft, is that and I'm really into Microsoft history and Apple history. And like they were always about like, we want to be everywhere. We want to be ubiquitous. Like we have no loyalty to anyone. We'll sell. They basically invented the PC compatible along with IBM, the idea of there being like something that's not Apple. That really is Microsoft that did that by saying, we'll just be on everything. And so maybe there's some theory to the case that there's like a continuity in that idea and what might end up happening to Xbox. But I think
Satya himself said it. He said it. Satya Nadella said during the FTC trial, I have no love for the world of exclusives. It goes against his instinct and it goes against Microsoft's ethos. And he says the only reason we do it is because the competition does it. So I think like there probably is a long enough timeline where entropy just makes Halo be on everything, you know? And like I say, when you look at Sony's margins, they're probably having the same thought processes too. Like, how much money could we make with Hellblade, Helldivers on Xbox? You know, launch it against Gears, and you know, screw Microsoft over. You know, and then
just like use it as a marketing beat. Like when the game declines this much, we have a port ready.
Exactly.
That will be like free marketing and hopefully get more people back on the game. Yeah. But my whole thing here, Jez, is that because my personal perspective is that Sony could bring literally every one of their games to Xbox and I wouldn't really care. If you're looking at it from an analysis standpoint, though, from me, I look at it and I wonder if what Sony's thinking is they're kind of capitulating, you know, in some way. Like we can kind of let them.
I can write it out.
Right. Like we don't need them really, like right now. If anything, like they've started the clock on bringing games to PC. So they're like, let's say 8 years behind the curve or whatever on this idea of bringing games multi-platform. Because I look at the whole thing, it was in that Guardian article, I think, where Rare was saying like Sony has been massively helpful. And I'm like, I'm sure they have been, you know, and I am sure from their standpoint with the leaking and all of that, they probably had some serious conversations there being like, you guys cannot say a fucking word, you know, about, because you have to lease the consoles and get access to PlayStation Neighborhood and all sorts of things that you have to do. And so you have to deal with Sony pretty deeply. And so I look at all of that not leaking about Sony and I'm sure Sony looks at it and says like, we could make money, but if we play this in the mid and long term, they might not even be an issue anymore and we can just move on. So I don't know about like, it's funny because Helldivers 2 is the most slow. I'm sorry, what did you say?
That might be why Microsoft's moving slow,
right?
Because they're like, we don't want them to think we're going all in here.
Well, because you have to imagine the meetings at Sony about this stuff is like, yeah, like it's kind of like the Jenga tower. Like if we can just pop a few of these things out of them, Like, why give them a tourniquet when you have your knee on their neck? And so from a strategy standpoint, I don't know if that would happen. From a personal standpoint, I don't really give a shit. I mean, the one thing I think is certain is that the Bungie, from my position, the Bungie acquisition was so ill conceived and such a bad idea that you can, and we know from them immediately that those games are going to be third party, that it's going to be extra urgent for them to perform on multiple platforms. We know they're going to be there, but they need to do very, very well disassociated from Sony, because we saw from Totoki basically him calling them out, and he said they're unaccountable. Like, he was like, you're unaccountable, you know, and don't care enough about making us money. And it's like, damn, that might have been something you wanted to figure out before you bought them. But nonetheless, they and they're not a cash rich company, you know, like they spent a lot. That's a lot of money for them to spend, and they had to write it down like billions of dollars at a time on their statements. And so I think that there's some part of Sony that will be multi-platform, and you already see that. Like, the most canny acquisition I think they made in some senses in recent years is Nix's, just because that's what and they're doing a great job. And the second probably smartest acquisition, although they lost the leaders of the studio and it's a pretty different studio now, is Valkyrie, just from the I'm sorry, actually Neon Koi now, just because they are making a mobile game, and I think it's vital for Sony to get a footprint onto mobile gaming too. So, but you won't hear. I'm a pretty laissez-faire PlayStation fan. I get that there are much more territorial PlayStation fans that not only don't want games to go anywhere else, but are mad about the PC migration. But I look at the PC migration specifically as people you are not going to get. Sony has had years to get these people. It's not happening. So just sell your games to them and we'll all survive. But there could be some blowback. We'll see. It's like you said, like maybe this hurt. If Microsoft brings Halo, maybe in the long term, this has a negative effect. It could be that Sony is shooting itself in the foot by bringing its games to PC because they want that 30% capture on everything sold on PlayStation. But they have to spread the field. So I think
there isn't
good.
There is a point to that. Like, you got to remember that it's not free to run your own ecosystem. I had this conversation with someone at Microsoft, and they were like when you consider, we take a 30% cut on Steam, but our overheads on our own store are like 18%, you know, because you got to run out servers, you got customer support, all that kind of stuff. So there are overheads to run your own system as well. And like so when you account for that, it's not as big as a leap as you might expect. I don't know what Sony's overheads are for their store, but there's that to consider as well. You know, there's so many different aspects to the game business, you know, that sometimes it is frustrating when they aren't transparent about the GamePass business model and what are their true projections for the next however many years. Will we be on an app? What is the technology that's coming down the pipeline? Sarah Bond was talking about the next Xbox is going to be technologically innovative. What does that mean? Like, I love all this stuff. I think it's really exciting. I love seeing I think one of the reasons why I think like some people do get territorial from a console fanboy perspective, but I think as well as some of the territorialness is we don't want to see the paradigm go away. We don't want to see consoles go away. We don't want to see our libraries become mothballed or orphaned on hardware systems that aren't going to be updated anymore. Like, it was so cool seeing my 360 games come across to Xbox One and then see all that come across to Xbox Series S and X. And I don't want to let that go. And I think like it's the same when some PlayStation fans see Sony going to PC, and then it feels like everyone's capitulating to Steam. You know, EA shut down their own store, and Blizzard had Battle.net, the legend Battle.net. And now Blizzard's putting their games on Steam. Like, who'd have thought that had ever happened? Call of Duty came back to Steam. You know, maybe Call of Duty never left, and I'm getting it mixed up with something else. Ubisoft came back to Steam. So, I don't know, man. I think people just don't want to see competition get eroded, but that means, like, we all need to get out there and start, you know, stand in the street with our placard saying, buy a console, buy a PlayStation, buy an Xbox, you know, because for whatever reason, the kids don't want them. The youth
I don't blame them.
Know, man.
I don't really blame them. Like, it's all about what you've been literally indoctrinated into, you know? And
yeah, kind of.
It's just, it's funny because I've observed that. It's just anecdotal, but with my own nieces and nephews, I have 6 of them, and I've thoroughly indoctrinated them into video games. And it took with some of them, but a couple of them specifically are huge nerds, but they're quite unlike their contemporaries in some sense, not in their nerdiness, but in what they're into and nerd out about and how they interact with it. I understand like a young 12-year-old or whatever being like, console gaming is like, well, why would I even want, what is this?
Yeah,
why do I need
true.
this? This is a very unique thing, but they don't come from the era of the VCR and the camcorder and all these weird bespoke, silos of entertainment and how you would execute on the entertainment. They just have the one and all in one device. And I don't blame them, but I do I try to tell my audience, and I'm sure your audience feels the same way and you feel the same way, is that like letting in, finding bigger audiences that are not necessarily like you will allow that platform that you love to exist for longer than it otherwise would have, because it's a supplement that is necessary, and that the companies want to ultimately attract those players to their place of primary business in their walled garden, so they make the most money out of them. So there's going to be this constant attempt to get these people, and we make it sound, I want to reiterate, we're making it sound worse than it is. Like, I think console gaming is healthy. It's just not growing. And
it's all about growth. There's nothing wrong with the industry per se. Billions of dollars go through this industry for every platform, but it's just that pesky growth thing. And yet, because your costs always go up, so you have to grow. You absolutely have to grow. No matter what company you are, costs will always grow. Costs will always go up. So, yeah, I don't know.
Well, let's end it there. I've kept you long enough. It's been good to talk to you, Jez.
No, it's just fun, man.
I'm glad to have you on Sacred Plus to chat about all the things. I don't know why I thought we already did one, but I guess it was because I did your show. Plus, and you come up on the show somewhat often, actually, just because you're one of the few people I talk to behind the scenes. I don't really talk to almost anyone, but I like talking to Jez behind the scenes. So you're very welcome on our show. Everyone can find you at Windows Central, the website, and then on Xbox-centric, your podcast. That you do, and I've been on that podcast as well, so that's been fun. Where else can people find you on social media? I guess Twitter. Yeah,
at Jez Corden, JZCORDEN, and thanks for having me, man. This was it's always fun and to talk gaming, and there is this weird transitionary time, but I think you'll all be okay in the end.
I think so too.
And I am actually excited for the future. I really want to see the PlayStation handheld, Xbox handheld. Let's see where it all goes, man.
Yeah, me too. I think the idea of a unified, it's funny that Switch has kind of revolutionized and revitalized the idea of handheld gaming in a traditional sense, but also leaned into kind of the mobile gaming trends and kind of spurred their traditional competitors into being like, oh, we maybe shouldn't cede the space to you after all. But they're figuring
really
out,
interesting to watch.
Yeah, it's fat, and I'm excited. I'm most interested in what Xbox does, just because I feel like they will maybe need to make the most drastic moves to get attention, and so you could find something from them that would be very unexpected. And again, it reminds me of like reading gaming magazines in the mid-aughts when it's like, what would a Xbox PSP look like, and all that kind of stuff. And you're kind of wanting, it's not going to be a dedicated handheld. Now it's going to be a ubiquitous Xbox. So I'm excited to see that. But my very best to you and yours. And I appreciate you again taking the time. And I thank all of you out there for your love, kindness, and support of all things Sacred Symbols and Last Stand Media here on Patreon, patreon.com/laststandmedia. Couldn't do without you. Laststandmedia.store for merch, as you know. We'll see you next time for more. Until then, goodbye. Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Colin's Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand's shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.